rather than concentrated solutions, which is near and dear to our stewardship direction. Erica is an award-winning independent journalist who writes about water, climate change, plants, and critters for Scientific American, the New York Times, Nature, The Atlantic, The Guardian, National Geographic, The Economist, Washington Post, Biographic, Wired, and more. Her book, which I heartily recommend, Water Always Wins, Thriving in an Age of Drought and Deluge, is about what she calls slow water innovations that are helping us adapt to the increasing floods and droughts brought by climate change. As a keynote speaker and moderator, she talks about environmental issues she covers, especially the slow water movement, documented in Water Always Wins. Engagements include on NPR Science Friday, Kara Think, KQED Forum, New Mexico PBS, and many other locations. She is a National Geographic explorer, served as a staff editor at various publications, and co-founded and edited 2 environmental news startups, Climate Confidential and This Week in Earth. She studied journalism and holds a master's degree in literature with a focus on eco-criticism, which is an actual thing. I'm so excited to introduce Erica Gies to speak to us today about slow water, and you will be seeing from the Carmel River Watershed Conservancy some stewardship programs based on these principles. Thank you. Erin, I think we're ready for that. Yes. Is that good? Do we need to?
It's warming up.
Okay.
Here it comes.
Thank you, Elise and Lauren, for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here. One of the really cool things about writing this book is I have been invited to communities all over the United States to give talks like this, and it's so neat to see different landscapes and the communities in those landscapes and how people are caring for them. And I grew up in the South Bay, so your landscape is quite familiar to me, and it's so incredibly beautiful, and I'm really happy to be here. So I think for most people who live in California, water is kind of a low-key obsession. Even for people who don't know very much about it. But then when I started reporting on it, it was just so endlessly fascinating to me. You know, the more I learned, the more I realized there was to learn. And in particular, I got to know a lot about water's relationships with soil and rock and microbes and plants and beavers and humans. And so we're here for World Wildlife Day, and of course nothing can live without water, but also water has these really interesting, complicated relationships with different entities, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I thought that was me. Anyway, in the dominant culture, we have this very kind of control-oriented attitude toward water. And we tend to see it either as a commodity if we're worried about scarcity, or a threat if we're worried about flooding. But that legacy of control is failing increasingly often. We're seeing terrible floods, terrible droughts, and I think it's time for us to change our relationship with water. And not all people think of it as a commodity or a threat. I traveled around the world for my book research, and this picture was taken in the Mesopotamian marshes of Iraq. This woman is Madan, which means marsh dweller, and she's part of a 9,000-year culture of people who, instead of draining and filling wetlands, they live on top of them, and they see water as life, and they get much of what they need from the natural environment. And during that time,
it's thought that potentially this is the biblical Garden of Eden because it's such a rich area. Okay, there we go. So they raise water buffalo. They take the milk and cheese from there. They fish. They trade with people on land for veg. This landscape right here is an island made of those tall reeds, Phragmites australis, which is, you may know it as very invasive in other places, but it's native to the Mesopotamian marshes, and it's a really key renewable resource they have there. They get around by boats called mashufs. This design of the house has basically remained unchanged for 9,000 years, minus the blue tarp. And this is called the Mudif. It's their community center, and it's also built entirely of reeds. And it's incredibly cool and a really nice place to be. So during the 9,000 years, the Medan have lived atop the Mesopotamian marshes. Many, many different irrigated civilizations have risen and fallen around them. And every time the irrigation infrastructure would fall into disrepair, the water would retake their marshes and the Medan would continue. And the longevity of this culture really pales in comparison to our own, and I think the way that they think about water may be part of that. So this is my book. The one over here is the North American edition, which I believe is available here today somewhere. British editions, Chinese editions. And I think the slow water movement that Elise talked about is something that's happening around the world. So I was excited to see the book picked up in other places. And really the message is, if we can ask ourselves, what does water want? And if we can think in terms of collaboration rather than control, we can win too. And climate change is something that's very overwhelming. People feel like it's so big, governments aren't doing what they should. But what's really empowering about the slow water movement is that this is something that people are doing in their own communities with their neighbors to make themselves more resilient. And every little bit helps, and the impact is cumulative. So it actually can have an impact on not just adapting to climate change, but also helping to reduce climate change. So this is near Sacramento, both of these pictures. California is famous for our big droughts, but also our big rains. This one with the water was 2017, 2017 I think, and this one was 2015. And you may know that with climate change, with every degree Celsius warming, the atmosphere can hold 7% more water on average. And so that's why it's part of why we're seeing these really big floods and also bigger droughts, because the atmosphere is thirstier, it sucks up more water but doesn't turn into rain. But the important thing is that it's not just climate change that is causing these water extremes. A lot of it has to do with our development choices. So this is urban sprawl, industrial agriculture and farming, and the very kind of concrete control-oriented way that we approach water. So we're making these disasters much worse, and the good news is that we can do things differently and make them a lot better. But in the dominant culture, when we have these big disasters, often you hear people saying, we need more infrastructure, we need bigger dams, we need bigger reservoirs, more levees. But that's the opposite of what we need. So I think it helps to think about the roots of this attitude, which is really kind of human-centric, right? We're most important, what we need is most important. And so it leads to this kind of single-focus problem solving. You're worried about flooding, you build walls, you build levees. You're worried about drought, let's build reservoir, bring in some water from elsewhere. But putting ourselves first in this way isn't working, because we're undermining these complex systems that water is in relationship with, including wildlife and soil and plants. And many indigenous and traditional cultures I met around the world don't think of water as a what, a commodity or threat, but rather a who, a friend or a relative. And I think innate in that kind of idea is a responsibility, a sense of caretaking, not just right to water, but also responsibility for taking care of it. So, there we go. The scale at which we have interfered with the natural water cycle is really extreme. We've drained or filled as much as 87% of the world's wetlands, dammed and diverted 2/3 of the world's large rivers. The area, floodplains exist to absorb floods, and when you build on them with concrete and houses, they can't absorb floods. So you're increasing flood risk for those people, but you're also increasing flood risk elsewhere on the river because you're raising the water level, you're taking space away from water. And so in general, we've had this pattern of really drying out the land and desiccating the land. And we've come to think of the West as a very dry place, but it wasn't so dry historically, and it doesn't need to be this dry if we have a different relationship with land and a different approach to how we manage water on land. So the people I met in my book, I came to think of them as water detectives because they really approach water with a sense of curiosity. And these are engineers, ecologists, landscape architects, farmers, urban planners, ranchers, and they start asking this rather radical question, which is, what does water want? Not just what do we want, but what does water want? And what I came to understand was what water wants is a return of its slow phases that are particularly prone to disruption from our development. So this is, like I said, wetlands, floodplains, mountain meadows, forests. And all around the world, people are coming to the same understanding when they pay attention to the land, when they pay attention to water. And so I came to think of this as the slow water movement. And it's kind of akin to the slow food movement, and that it's ultimately local. Every place has unique geology, ecology, and human culture. And so it's working within the water that you have available in your area. And it's really about protecting what's left of these natural water systems and restoring what we can and making more space for water. And as Elise said, it's really distributed across the landscape. In our kind of concrete water culture, we have these big centralized projects, a big reservoir that's holding a big amount of water, or these, the LA River canal, the concrete canal that's whooshing all the water off the land. But slow water projects are small and they're distributed across the landscape. And that makes sense if you think of the 87% of wetlands that have been erased. You start to understand why you need lots of little small places for water to slow on the land again. But what's really cool about that is, like I said, every little bit helps. So if you have a small area, you can do that, and that helps. And when somebody down the road or down the river does another one, it's cumulative. The impact is cumulative. So even though every slow water project is unique, they do have some commonalities that I was able to identify. So instead of that single focus problem solving, we're worried about flooding, let's build a wall, it instead involves systems thinking. So if you can retain your rain locally, then you have it available in the dry season. And you're also caring for the critters in the soil, the plants who are going to help maintain that water for later. It's distributed rather than centralized. It's ideally local, helping us to understand local water availability and work within it. It's socially just. So I think, when you have a levee, you kind of understand, okay, it's protecting that one community, but it's raising the water level in the river. And so if there's another community over here who doesn't have a levee, you're actually increasing flood risk for them. And it also gives people a false sense of security. Oh, we've got a levee, we're protected, so you get a bunch more development right behind it. But water people have a joke about levees, which is there are two kinds, ones that have failed and ones that are going to fail. And so if you have a lot more stuff behind that levee, then you have more that's going to be in trouble when you have that disaster. Similarly, dams. We love dams in California, or we have historically loved dams. But they are also an environmental injustice. They have brought water to 20% of the world's population and decreased water availability to 24% of the world's population. So we're not just taking water away from other ecosystems, we're also taking water away from other people. And the receivers may seem lucky, but there's something called the reservoir effect, which is this false sense of abundance, right? And so a lot of the water problems we experience in the West are because we brought water from elsewhere and we expanded farming, development, et cetera, beyond what we really have the capacity to support. And the problem is when we have that erratic supply, then we have these times of extreme stress. But we're really wasting a lot of water. We're whooshing it away because we're worried about flooding. So the more we can slow water on the land, take the rain that falls, store it underground locally, the more buffer that we have in that system. And lastly, slow water projects are community oriented. In some places I went, like India or Peru, communities are actually actively hands-on managing these projects. In other places, maybe it's a park. The floodplain has been reverted to a park. So it can flood when necessary, people can enjoy it when it's not flooded, and maybe there's signage that explains to the public what the land and water are doing in this place. So typically, slow water projects start with something called historical ecology, and that just means, what was nature and water doing here before we changed it? And this is one way to deduce what water wants. And these maps here are South Seattle. This is the Duwamish watershed. And so you can see the river with all of its curves and its floodplain, which is kind of a typical water pattern. And then over here you see it's been dramatically straightened and levied. There's development right up to the side. And this is a very typical development pattern that we do. So the point of mapping what water used to do is people say water has a memory. Water wants to go where it wants to go. And it's going to do that, or it's going to try to do that even when we subvert it. And so oftentimes you'll see, people will fill in a wetland and build an apartment building, and when we get some rain, that's the first area to flood, right? And so if we can map where water used to go, then cities and regions can do some longer term planning and think, okay, well, there is actually a lot of turnover. We think things are set, it's built, we're done, but there's a lot of turnover, and so that gives us an opportunity to return that space to water in a thoughtful way, and to think about the optimal places for that. For example, there was a project I looked at in Seattle where they were having urban flooding all the time, and they found the floodplains, and they returned just 1,600 feet of a 15-mile-long river to the river, but that was enough to eliminate flooding because that's where the water wanted to go. So this is what happens sometimes when we ignore what water wants. This is in Fraser Valley, which is in British Columbia. And this area 100 years ago was reclaimed from 4 rivers and a lake. And the indigenous people who lived there understood that the lake moved a lot with the seasons. And so they didn't build any permanent things right alongside. They lived up on the hills and used the lake a lot and camped near the lake, but didn't build near it. So after this disaster, which is atmospheric river storm in November that causes flooding and closed down a lot of shipping and highways and was quite a disaster. And so, the slogan was "Build Back Better." And the question is, what does that mean? There was a city that flooded that was like, they pumped water constantly to keep that lake from reforming, and they said, we should build another pump. We should build bigger levees. And then there were people who were arguing, maybe we should return some of this land to the lake, including some of the indigenous groups who are still in that area, the Samath and Stolo people. And there was a study from the University of British Columbia that found buying out landowners and moving homes and businesses to higher ground to allow part of the lake to reflood would cost about $3 billion. But maintaining the status quo through 2050 would cost $4.5 billion. And the rebuilding alone from this disaster is expected to cost more than $9 billion. And of course, it's going to flood again. And the question is, how soon? How soon are we going to be spending that $9 billion again? So one of the rivers that floods into the Fraser Valley has its roots in Washington State. And it's called the Nooksack River. And during this big storm, it did jump its banks and flow downhill. And so some people in Canada were saying, you've got to build a levee. What are you doing? There's a natural levee there that the river formed, but they haven't doubled down on it. And I talked to their river and floodplain engineering manager, and she said, when you divert water from one flow path to another, you own those damages. You're choosing to flood another community worse. And so Washington has taken a different route, and over the last 10 or 20 years, they have something called floodplain integrated planning process, which follows the 10 golden rules of floodplain management. And the first rule of floodplain management is accepting that it's impossible to prevent flooding. Number 2 is to present some flooding as desirable. That's because if you don't give water enough space, it's going to take it. So it's better to choose where it might cause the least harm to give water that space. And, it hasn't been an easy process. Like, there are farmers who have been farming there forever. There are tribes in that area, various government officials with their responsibilities for flooding protection. But, they've been talking to each other in their community. They've had this organized process, and they've really made a lot of progress with it. And so during that disastrous flood in British Columbia, people did not suffer damages in Washington State. They had that extra space in the floodplain for the river. They had some log jams that were meant to deflect the energy away from the levees, and the project worked as intended. They slowed the water, and people did not flood. And, I recently just reported a story for Scientific American about the Pajaro River, which you probably remember flooded a couple of years ago. And the Army Corps of Engineers has had a long-standing obligation to that area to build, because they had 8-year levees. And so my story is about these really forward-thinking people in the San Francisco office of the Army Corps of Engineers who are engineering with nature, which I rolled my eyes about for a while, but then I decided to dig into it. And it is kind of early days with the Corps, but the San Francisco office really is leading, and they've done an incredible, they're just starting to break ground on this Pajaro project, which is going to take about 12 years, I think, to complete. But they are basically moving the levees back from the edge of the river channel and giving the river more space, and some of the creeks that go in there too. And they are contouring it for habitat, for the steelhead. The river is going to continue to reshape it. There's going to be groundwater recharge that happens as a result of the slowed water. So it's really quite an inspirational project. So one thing that was really apparent to me in recording this was the relationship between surface water and groundwater. In California, we have this long history of, we're short on surface water, so we'll just pump groundwater, and there's been this sort of myth that it's magical extra water. But of course, it's the same water, as you can see in this diagram. They're connected. And when you pump groundwater, you're actually also depleting surface water, because the groundwater, when it's a healthy level, it's pushing up from the bottom and feeding the surface water. Similarly, if you have excess surface water and you're able to root it over the ground, then it can infiltrate and help keep that groundwater table healthy. And so, I was talking earlier about how dry we tend to think it is here. But in fact, a lot of our seasonal streams used to run year-round because they were supplied with a healthy groundwater table from below. We've had some kind of hand-wringing in recent years about the big atmospheric river storms, and because we understand the value of that water, and it's all getting away because we're whooshing it off the land. But there are ways that we can capture that water, move it underground, and store it for later and help to recharge the groundwater, which helps support the ecosystems, the vernal pools, the critters, the plants. And it's also a very important fire protection, right? Well-hydrated plants don't burn as easily. So I learned about something called paleo valleys. And basically, there's a geologist, a hydrogeologist at UC Davis who has spent 40 years studying them. And they're kind of the ancestors of today's rivers. And the ones he was focused on come down the Sierra into the Central Valley. And the rivers that are coming off the Sierra today are the descendants of those earlier rivers. And during various periods of the glacial cycles, the rivers would run a lot bigger, and they would cut these divots into the Central Valley floor, and then later they would be kind of backfilled with very coarse rocks. So what that means is you have these river valleys that are just under the surface that are super porous because they're filled with rocks instead of that clay. So if you can find them and move your extra floodwater over them, it can move underground 60 times faster. So that helps to eliminate downstream flooding, and it helps to recharge that groundwater to make that available for people who are pumping later. And this area here doesn't have those glacial paleo valleys, but almost all rivers do have something called paleo channels, which are kind of a smaller but similar idea. So with the Groundwater Sustainability Management Act, people are coming together with their communities to figure out how to balance their groundwater usage. And one way is definitely recharging groundwater. And the state is starting to think about it in a much more serious way, I would say over the last 5 years or so. And this is a way of searching for them, right? They're underground, so we don't know exactly where they are. But this is sort of like taking an MRI of the underground. And DWR, the Department of Water Resources, paid for 3 years of studies in basins that were overdrafted to try to see if we could find these, just to let people know, like, you know, hey, you have one of these really special geological features in your area, maybe you want to use it to recharge groundwater. And just in general, you know, California has about 1,400 reservoirs, and the open space in these aquifers that we pumped too much out of contains 3 times the volume. And so the state is really starting to take much more seriously the idea of storing water underground. You know, before it was sort of like out of sight, out of mind, but they're beginning to realize the value of that. It also protects it from evaporation, which, you know, about a quarter of water stored in reservoirs is lost to evaporation. Anyway, this is the kind of map that they draw. The red is actually the paleo valleys. You might think it should be the blue, that's what I think. But anyway, it's an interesting scientific process. But then, of course, you know, if you have one, then you have to work with your community about the land use and decide that that's an important priority. And I think the goal of my book was to really help people think more about how water works. Because if you think about that, the solutions become much more obvious. And one critter who has a very good idea of how water works is our friend the beaver, which is another important way of rehydrating the landscape. So you probably know when European settlers first came, there was a big beaver hunting craze, and most of the beavers were killed. And it's thought that today we have maybe 10% of the beavers that we did historically. And before, you know, the beavers build their dams, which create ponds and wetlands. And it's thought that before the hunting, 10% of North America was beaver-created wetlands. And so, you know, we had a much wetter landscape than we think. And because the trappers came ahead of the settlers, by the time the settlers came, the land had already dried out. And so we have, you know, that shifting baseline syndrome where what we think is normal, in fact, isn't. And, beavers have had a hard go of it. A lot of times people think that they're bad because they think that they cause floods. In fact, there's a different species of beaver in Europe, which is quite similar, that was completely extirpated, killed from the British Isles 400 years ago. So for 400 years, they haven't had beavers. They did persist in parts of Europe, like Germany. And so in recent years, people have been doing, you've heard of guerrilla gardening? They've been guerrilla beavering, dropping beavers into streams where they wanted to kind of restore the habitat. But interestingly, one of the important reasons they're using them there is to reduce flooding, because they have a lot of towns that are right up against these rivers, and they get these bigger storms from climate change, and they're flooding, they're having terrible disasters. And a beaver dam is sort of like flattening the curve during the pandemic. The same water is still going to go downstream because the dam is a little bit porous, but over a much longer period of time. So the height of the river isn't going to get as high, and that can eliminate flooding. And scientists have studied that and found that peak flows were 30% lower on average in areas with beaver dams. So in the West, we actually have parachuted beavers into the backcountry in Idaho and California in the mid-20th century. And the reason for that was because 100 years ago, people understood that beavers heal sick stream systems and make them better habitat for fish. And they tried taking them in by burrow, like in crates on the sides, and they're kind of skittering around, and the burrows weren't having it, and so that's when they came up with the parachuting idea, which was quite successful. So in the West, in the modern era, but again, like they flip in popularity. People are like, oh, beavers are the answer, and then people think, oh, there's a problem, we have to kill them, we have to dynamite their dams. But in the modern era, in the 1990s, Washington State got very serious about beaver reintroduction. And since then, all Western states have followed, including like Wyoming, where you might not think. And the reason is because farmers and ranchers have realized the benefits that they bring. One farmer in Northern California told me he doesn't have to water his alfalfa fields because it's near a beaver pond, and that raises the water table, and so the plant is getting what it needs without irrigation. Similarly, ranchers are finding that they have great fodder that's growing because of the moisture that the beavers bring, because they're raising the water table not just in the area of their dam, but also across the wider area. And in California, we get about 30% of our water historically from snowmelt, but we're losing that snowmelt with climate change. So beavers with their ponds is another great way to slow water on the land and move it underground and have it available into the dry season to help keep those streams running through the dry season. A study in Washington found that beaver ponds store 75 times more water above and below ground than a stream without them. And in places where it rains rather than snows, beaver ponds can increase summer water availability by 20%. Beavers are also firefighters, right? They create fire breaks with their ponds. Water doesn't burn, but also the plants around are better hydrated and less likely to burn. So you may know this, but in 2022, California finally got with the program in a big way and created 5 permanent positions in the Fish and Wildlife Service to help bring beavers back to California for water conservation, for fire prevention, and importantly for biodiversity. Because beavers, their ponds are incredible havens for wildlife. This one beaver researcher I talked to, they set up a wildlife cam to check out the place where they were planning to reintroduce beavers, and for 1 or 2 years they saw almost nothing, a squirrel, a bird. They reintroduced the beavers and they kept the camera up, and every species you can imagine in that region were coming, including beaver predators like mountain lions and cougars. So they really just make a really critical resource that we that we need. And this beaver dam is in Northern California near Mount Lassen. It's a really beautiful one. On the other side, there's a flowing stream. So when talking about like how much drier it is here than it used to be, I think Elise was referring to the slow it, spread it, sink it, store it. This was coined by Brock Dolman at the Occidental Ecology Center up in Sonoma. And he calls the last 500 years the age of drainage. And so it's all those things I was talking about, like getting rid of the wetlands, levying the rivers, cutting them off from their floodplains, killing the beavers. And in so many ways, we've really dried out the landscape, cutting the forests. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So I went to Arizona, near Tucson, which we tend to think of as an incredibly dry place. And it is, but what we don't really realize is that we've changed a lot. Settlers have changed a lot. So I think people are probably familiar with the idea that the Colorado River is really over-allocated. There used to be this incredible wetlands in Arizona going into the Sea of Cortez that we just don't have anymore because there isn't water for it. But there used to be a fair number of trees in places in the mountains of southern Arizona and places like that were cut. And then really, really, really hard cattle grazing, like 50 times the cattle that they have now, which, denuded, took up all the plants, compacted the soil. And so now when you have monsoon rains, you have these flash floods, and then the water is gone in a few hours. And we think that that's just the way it is in Arizona. But it wasn't always that way, and some people are following an indigenous method to slow water in those washes. And basically, there are different methods for the elevation and the width of your stream, but it involves putting some little rocks across to just slow the water and to slow erosion. Erosion is a really big problem too, and it helps capture the water and helps it to move underground. But of course, in water scarce places, the neighbors downstream were like, they're taking our water. And so a scientist who works for USGS in Tucson was really curious about that, and she thought, I want to study this. And so she, I believe, is the one who coined this term, natural infrastructure for dryland streams. And what she emphasizes is it's not water retention, we're not retaining your water, it's water detention. We're slowing the water. And what she found is that taking care of the stream in this way actually creates abundance. So this is those landowners' stream after just a couple of monsoon seasons, and it now runs year-round. And they've restored these wetlands and drylands. And when the scientist Laura Norman measured this, she compared this stream where they had treated it with a neighboring stream that was just as we expect. This stream had 28% more water. And it's because it slows, it moves underground, and then it continues to supply over time. Whereas when you just have it rushing over a rock, a lot of it is evaporating straight away. And so she has started doing this on state lands around Arizona. There's some nonprofits who are doing it too, also in northern Mexico. And it's moving into Colorado and Utah. And people are thinking about doing this in headwaters. You could have a beaver do it, but if you don't have beavers, humans could do it. And indigenous people in both Mexico and the U.S. Southwest have been doing this. I interviewed a Hopi farmer for this story, and they farm with the amount of water that they capture because they're slowing it on the land, because they have these ways to kind of hold it and retain it. And he told me 3,000 years of replication is a science. So there is a hydrologist and climatologist named Mike Dettinger who has become very intrigued with this after reading my book, and he wrote a paper that he submitted to the state for promoting this kind of thing, especially in headwater lands in California. So it's a helpful technique that people could consider if they have access to that. So I want to talk a little bit about trees. Forestry is another major way that we have disrupted the land. And not just forestry, the hard grazing as well, but clear cutting, just intensive. We're not clear cutting in California anymore, but even the level of cutting that we are doing is quite extreme and really drying out the land. So plants' roots help water move underground. The critters in the ground I saw some gophers yesterday when I was here. They actually are, digging burrows, and that also helps water move underground. Little things like, tardigrades and really tiny voles, of course, yeah. So a lot of times when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about how climate change is going to affect plants and critters. But in fact, biology also affects climate. The relationship goes both ways. And healthy ecosystems that have a balanced water cycle, actually, they're buffering water extremes, the floods and droughts, and they're also helping to stabilize climate change itself. So plants exhale vapor as part of their photosynthetic process, right, when they're making food for themselves. And that condenses again into rain, and that can fall again locally, regionally, and even globally. There's something called eco-climate teleconnections, which is when that vapor goes into the jet stream. And so deforestation can actually cause drought on the other side of the country or the other side of the planet, and reforestation and taking care of healthy lands can reverse that. Over continents, on average, 40% of rain comes from soil and plants. So if we're not taking care of our land, and if we are not helping that moisture to be retained in healthy ecosystems, we're actually actively creating less rain for ourselves and our neighbors. So forest fires are becoming a year-round thing here now. And that is partly because of climate change, partly because we have hotter air, but it is also because of this disruption to the water cycle that I've been talking about. This picture was taken in Lassen Volcanic National Park, which is a place that's very special to my family. And this is in the aftermath of the Dixie Fire, which was in 2021. And it burned 60% of the national park. And you can see 2 years later, the undergrowth plants are back. You can't really see in this picture, but not all trees burned, even in burned areas. Some trees survived. And so it was really interesting to see how a healthy ecosystem responded to the fire, even a really intense fire like that. And I noticed a really marked difference. There are Forest Service lands right outside the park that they look like the ideal forest that we should have, right? You've got trees that are widely spaced apart. There's no understory at all because people have been logging here and there. But the land right outside of Chester, California, even, we were there again last year, nothing is growing there. It's a totally devoid of any kind of life landscape. And so, it's the way in which they dried out the land really harmed it from that type of intense forestry. So the soil is minerals, but it's also life. It's got a lot of organic matter in it. It's decomposing plants, it's all kinds of little critters. And soil that has good organic content can hold orders of magnitude more water. So when you log intensively or graze intensively, you're killing the plants, you're drying out the soil, you're killing the critters in the soil. So that means that the water can't absorb, it can't move underground as well, and if you have a big rain, it might just run off. So there's many problems associated with that, and sometimes people think like, oh, well, we cut the trees, but we planted the trees. But oftentimes you're killing this very complex ecosystem and then basically creating a plantation of one or two species. We see that here with conifers. We see that in places like Indonesia with palm oil plantations. So, we do need things. We do need to harvest, but this idea that you can just substitute one for the other and it's the same. It's just not true, especially when it comes to thinking about the water cycle and wildlife and diversity. So we hear a lot about fires that fuel loading is the problem. Climate change is the problem, fuel loading is the problem, we need to break the forests. But in many cases, that's an excuse from logging industry just to do more logging. And in fact, a study of 1,500 fires in the western US over 30 years found that protected forests had much lower fire severity, and areas with more logging had a higher burning severity. And it's because of this phenomenon of how much it dries out, not just the soil, but also the plants that aren't there to transpire in the same way. There are fungal networks, which you might have learned about, that connect the trees. They can share resources, they can share water. They are disrupted when you cut all the trees, in British Columbia, before clear cutting, there are a couple hundred different species of mycorrhiza underneath the forest. After clear cutting, there's 4 or 5, and not the ones that pass water around. So basically, the scientists that I've interviewed on all of these stories, they just keep coming back to what we really need to do is to conserve what's left, what's intact ecosystems, and restore what we can. And yesterday I got to walk out to the floodplain of the Colorado River there with Rachel from the Big Sur Land Trust, and I saw some of the work that you're doing there, and I'm really excited that we're going to see this other floodplain after the talk. And this is just such an incredibly beautiful area, and you guys are largely reliant on the river for your water, so it's really neat to be in a place where people are taking care of it. Lauren was telling me he has hopes of getting some beavers back to your headwaters in the near future. So it seems like there's a lot of exciting things going on here. So this is my website if you want more information. And I'll just leave you with the idea that, as I said, climate change can feel really overwhelming. But slow water projects are very empowering. I've met so many communities who are, like you're doing, coming together with their neighbors to make their own places more resilient, and in doing so, contributing to the whole and making things better for people at a much greater distance as well. So I hope what you'll take away from this is to, as you're going about your day, as you see a stream or a creek, or you hear water, and you think, what does water want? And what can I do for water? Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Erica?
Yeah.
I'm a river and critter developer, so they can two questions about the paleo valleys, like how are they finding them and restoring them, and how many are there for that are they
Yeah.
if it's part of the recharge plan
Yeah. So Grandpa, the hydrogeologist I mentioned, he thinks every river coming off of this Sierra has a paleo valley in the Central Valley, and they're finding them using electromagnetic imaging from the air, and those are in the Central Valley, and those ones are by far the biggest because they were caused by the glacial cycles. But every river does have a pattern. I know, south of Santa Cruz, near Pajaro, there's a scientist from UC Santa Cruz who's looking at paleo channels, which are like a smaller version of that as a place for recharge. So the state isn't actively prioritizing this because it goes to the groundwater regional people to decide what they're going to do in their area, but the state is saying, hey, this is where they are, and maybe you should think about this. In terms of the state recharge, I think so far they're doing it on lands that they had previously established as possible for that, but they're not necessarily the optimal lands. But I know that they are definitely following this research, and that may be changing.
Are they doing some of these projects in Chester and those towns up there where it's so dry?
The question is, are they thinking about doing any of these types of projects in Chester and where it's dry up there? The projects I have seen involve some of the creeks in the area, like Battle Creek is one. Cal Trout has been really involved with that. They're taking out some old dams. They're restoring some areas. There's a large family ranch that surrounds the town of Mineral that the family has decided to restore the meadow ecosystem there. And that was incredibly valuable during the park fire last summer because the fire was coming right up to the towns of Mineral and Mill Creek, and that wet meadow was like the most effective fire break and probably saved the towns, along with very hard work by firefighters. Yeah? That's a good question. I mean, a lot of the ways that people farm around here are not helpful for water. There are different forms of farming, like no-till, syntropic agriculture, agriculture under trees, and so if there are ways to not disturb the soil, if there are ways to keep plants on the soil year-round, that can help to retain water. Allowing beavers to come back so that they can raise the water table and make irrigation less necessary. Finding places to recharge water where they can. So some in Pajaro, Andy Fisher at UC Santa Cruz has been working on it's kind of a credit program. So like if the farmers are willing to devote a small portion of their land to recharging off of the mountain when they get the big rains, because they're all pumping groundwater, that's their only source of water. And so basically they're offering them a credit against the groundwater they're pumping. So there are projects like that, but I would say that in general, most of the agriculture that goes on around here is not helping the water cycle much, yeah. But there's a lot that could be radically altered. I think it probably involves smaller farmers innovating and then people seeing that example. Andy Fisher at UCSC, yeah.
So here they're taking our sewage water and they're purifying it, and then they're pumping it down into our aquifer. And I get very worried that somehow, because it's not getting filtered through all the soil and such, that it's going to get contaminated at some point because of some malfunction. Have you seen elsewhere where they purify sewage water and they have run into trouble? Or is it pretty safe?
So I don't know exactly the details of how it's being handled here, so I can't speak to that exactly, but reused sewage water or recycled water is a very important source of water, given that we've overexpanded our population beyond what water availability that we have. And I cannot think of a single place where it's not been safe. Often it is treated to a certain level, and before it's put in, sometimes it's allowed to filter through the ground. Even if they're pumping it underground, I'm guessing because I don't know, they've either treated it enough before they did that, or it might be filtering through soil as it's coming out of there before it goes into the drinking water. But I personally wouldn't be concerned because people have been doing this for a long time, and I'm not aware of any health problems as a result.
It's very inspiring to go and do tours at the wastewater recycling plant. You know, they do tours regularly. If you want, we can set up a tour, but we've done one ourselves, and it's very informative because they basically mimic the walls of rock to go through. Oh, no. So it takes like 6 months, I think, to figure out.
In case people can't hear, she's saying that the sewage treatment center offers tours to explain this system to people, and it's very cool.
I wish we could sit and talk with you all day, but, you know.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
It's a really wonderful thing to be able to follow up Erica's talk to talk about a restoration of a floodplain project going on right here. How fabulous is that? Because now we've learned how important these floodplain projects are. I want to introduce Jake Smith, who is the Planning and Conservation Program Manager for the Parks District. Jake manages the natural and cultural resources conservation, preservation and restoration planning, and resource monitoring. He is the project leader for the ambitious Rancho Cañada floodplain project, and is going to first talk a little bit about the project and then take people who are interested on a walk to see what it looks like. Is it walking on cement so I can come along with my walker? Ooh, awesome. I might be able to enjoy it too then.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just give me a couple seconds to get set up.